Hey guys, how's it going? This is the Bald Metal Nerd coming at you with another wonderful vid. In this one, I figured I would talk about something, near and dear to my own heart. You already know what this is about based on the title. That obviously you clicked on. But just to give you a little bit of background, in my last video, I kind of picked on the Beatles a bit for, the fans. A lot of Beatles fans react very negatively when you say that the Beatles overreacted. They basically act like crybabies about it. Not all of them do, but I'd say a significant portion of their fan base is kind of that way. When you say anything other than the Beatles are God, you just basically get a whole lot of vitriol thrown your way. So I thought to myself, well, it's really easy to kind of tear down something that I'm not particularly a big fan of, right? So I was thinking to myself, well, it would be a lot more, I guess, fair of me to try to tear down something that I am a giant fan of. We're going to be talking about, the two biggest, most influential bands of my favorite genre, which of course is heavy metal, and you already know who those two bands are based on the title. We're going to be talking a bit about Black Sabbath and a bit about Metallica. We're going to see if either one of these bands is truly overrated, right? So we're going to go ahead and start off with Black Sabbath. And the reason we're starting with them as well, they are the first heavy metal band. My personal connection to Black Sabbath, I didn't get into them initially when I discovered heavy metal music. It took me a little bit. I didn't really get into them till, I don't know, maybe my sophomore year of high school or so, because I had been listening to heavy metal for maybe about 5 years or so by the time I really latched on to Black Sabbath. But when I got into them, I got into their early period pretty heavily because I realized just honestly how fantastic that music is. So let's, of course, talk about some of their early albums. And we're only going to be talking about studio albums. We're not going to be talking about live albums or compilations or anything of that nature. Just straight studio albums and their impact on music, their relative quality, blah, blah, blah. So let's dive right in. Of course, their first release, self-titled Black Sabbath from 1970. Obviously, this is the very first heavy metal record that had ever existed, period. Yes, there were songs and some things that were close to heavy metal before that album. I mean, they did exist, and there are examples of what I would call proto-heavy metal before heavy metal really crystallized as an art form, but this album really, for lack of a better term, kind of set all of the rules of the genre, if you will. And it really defined it as a completely separate thing just from straight rock and roll. It was kind of the point where I would say there was kind of a clean break from one genre to another, right? And it's really impossible to overstate the importance of this album to heavy metal. And it's fantastic. All of the songs on this are absolutely great, in my opinion. You got wonderful performances from everyone in the band. It's just a fantastic album. And then, of course, they followed up, later that year with Paranoid, which, of course, is, they play tons of songs from Paranoid on the radio even now. We're nearly 50 years later, and this thing is still a staple, to a lot of people. This is an absolutely fantastic, killer album as well. After that, they followed it up with Master of Reality, another great album. After that, Volume 4, again, another great album. And honestly, I know opinions differ a lot on these albums. All of these albums that we're going to be talking, that I'm going to show anyway, are kind of mostly all killer, very little filler, if any. I know that opinions on this are going to vary widely, but the songwriting was at such a high level on these early albums, and the execution and all that is just amazing. And then after that, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. I don't really know what to say about this, except It's absolutely an amazing album. It's hard for me to pick a favorite between this or their album number 6, Sabotage. Another killer album, but unfortunately, this is the last really good one of the Ozzy era. The two that followed that, well, at least the original Ozzy era, the two that followed that, Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, pretty mediocre compared to those first 6. There was a pretty, for those first 6 albums, they were way up here in quality. And then albums number 7 and 8, they kind of, they fell off the map as far as how good those albums were. Now, after Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, obviously Ronnie James Dio joined the band, and his albums are excellent, but not as good as the initial run of the Ozzy stuff. So if we say the original Ozzy stuff, the first 6 albums are up here, I would put the Dio albums maybe about there. They are a bit of a step down, but they're still really good. In Dio, I mean, he just has an indomitable voice. But honestly, I think Dio, his best work really was, him as a solo act, for lack of a better term. Holy Diver, for example, is an absolute must-own album for any metal fan that there is. Right? It's just, you gotta have it. And several, yeah. And I really liked Dio's work with Rainbow as well. So that's that. Then after the first Dio albums, you had a run of of work that really doesn't merit much mention. It's, the band kind of fractured after that point. It was mostly Tony Iommi just doing stuff and wasn't executing particularly well on anything. They had a number of different singers. Then Dio came back he came back, I believe, in 1992 from one album, Dehumanizer, which it's okay, but it's not as good as Mob Rules or Heaven and Hell. And then, I think Black Sabbath may have had a few meandering albums after that. Then there was, when the Dio era band reunited and called themselves Heaven and Hell, released that album, The Devil You Know, which is fantastic. Definitely worth checking out. Then after that, you have 13, which of course had Ozzy back in the band, and that was Sabbath's final record, and it's absolutely fantastic. It doesn't live up to their early 70s releases, but it'd be really hard for them to. It's still, a really solid cap to their legacy. In my opinion, they went out on a high note. 13 is really good. No qualms about that. So basically, how can we break down Sabbath's career? Pretty simply. They, had an initial run of incredibly groundbreaking and important albums that were absolutely fantastic and nearly flawless. Then they had a pretty big quality drop, album number 7, and then they picked it back up on album number 9. 9 and 10 were pretty good, and then they just went to shit. And then they did bounce back in the extremely latter part of their career. So who would consider that, overrated? Well, it's a very subjective thing. Some people may not like a lot of their albums. I mean, personally, like I said, if you worship everything the Sabbath does and you say everything they've ever done is fantastic, I think, honestly, you're just deluding yourself at that point, because they did produce a lot of crap. So basically, they invented a genre. They did some awesome initial music. Then they kind of fell out, produced crap for a long time, then came back and finished strong. That's how I would categorize Sabbath. And I think they definitely deserve their legendary status. So, moving on, we are going to talk now about Metallica. And Metallica is the first band that I ever got. Because of them, I got into heavy metal. I discovered Master of Puppets at age 11, and then that was pretty much it for me. So that's my personal history with the band. They were my favorite band for a long time. They were my favorite band, I think, till maybe about my sophomore, junior year of high school, when other bands kind of took over my favorite band spot at that point. But they were definitely my favorite band for a very long time. And even now, they are still one of my favorite bands. They're not it anymore, but they're still, I still hold them in pretty high regard for a lot of the work they've done. So, of course, we are initially going to talk about Kill 'Em All, Metallica's debut album. And what can we say about Kill 'Em All? Well, in my opinion, it's an absolutely fantastic album. It's better than two of the other big four bands. I think it's better than Show No Mercy, and I also think it's better than Fistful of Metal, respectively. Do I think it's better than Megadeth's Killing Is My Business? No. I think Killing Is My Business maybe slightly edges it out for quality, but here's the but. Kill 'Em All had, for lack of a better term, the first mover advantage. And yeah, I know Dave Mustaine helped co-write a lot of the songs on, Kill 'Em All, but, it came out first. It was hugely influential, even from day one when it hit the scene. No, it was not the first thrash album. No, Metallica did not invent thrash. Neither one of those things are correct. But it was certainly a very big deal in thrash, right? It was absolutely a something that very much helped crystallize the music and define thrash for a lot of people. And honestly, I would say, because I was looking back at, what came out in 1983, at least it's in my collection, and I was talking about how fantastic Holy Diver is because that came out the same year. I think this is slightly better. In fact, I would say Kill 'Em All is the best metal album of 1983. It's not perfect, but holy crap, is it ever great. Okay, so they follow that up with Ride the Lightning, 1984, right? Well, obviously, Ride the Lightning was a giant quantum leap forward. It was the biggest leap forward that Metallica ever took in their entire career. They changed directions pretty dramatically on Ride the Lightning. They went in a much more progressive direction. James really refined his vocal delivery quite a bit. They really perfected their guitar tones. Just everything kind of came together on Ride the Lightning, right? I mean, it's a total masterpiece, except for the song Escape, of course. That's its only slight blemish. But other than that, it's pretty much a perfect album. Obviously hugely influential to metal in general. Metallica was really going on the upswing at this point. Just an absolutely killer record that, had influenced tons of impact on the scene. And then, of course, they followed that up with Master of Puppets in 1986. And this is, a lot of people consider this Metallica's absolute high watermark as far as quality goes, the best thing they've ever done, and they'll never equal it. I don't think they'll ever equal it at this point. But it's, it's hard for me to pick a favorite between that and Ride the Lightning. Yes, Master of Puppets is slightly more technically perfect, right? You can listen to it and you can pick apart Ride the Lightning slightly more than you can pick apart Master of Puppets. But Ride the Lightning has a bit more rawness to it than Master of Puppets, and I like that. So it's really hard to pick a favorite between those two albums. They are both just incredibly wonderful, but Metallica really, shine that stone to absolute perfection on Master of Puppets, and it's absolutely just a fantastic, phenomenal album that has influenced millions and millions and millions of people to pick up the guitar and start playing, right? It influenced millions and millions and millions of people to get into heavy metal in the first place. The impact of that album cannot be overstated. And, it's at this point, I would say, I mean, it started earlier than this, because by, Master of Puppets is what really put Metallica on the map, as it were, as far as being a really major force in heavy metal. I mean, they were already big in the underground scene, but Master of Puppets really just put them there. And it would almost be fair to say that heavy metal sounded a certain way before Metallica, and then a certain way after Metallica, right? I don't think that would be an incorrect statement. The impact of those early albums that they had on the scene cannot be overstated. So, next, we're going to talk a bit about And Justice for All. Of course, the first album without Cliff, because Cliff died on the tour of Master of Puppets, as you guys are all aware. And what do I think of this album? I think for the first time, it's not the best metal album of the year released. I think the first 3 albums that Metallica did, those were the 3 best metal albums of those respective years. I think South of Heaven slightly beats this out, but I'd say this is probably in the top 5 metal albums of 1988. It's way up there. Its quality is still absolutely gigantic. It didn't have quite the impact on heavy metal as their earlier albums did, but it was still a really big deal. And still an absolutely fantastic album in my opinion, right? So, next we're going to talk about Metallica's, or one of their most controversial albums. We're talking about the Black Album, of course, that came out in 1991, and obviously on that album, Metallica decided to go in a much more, quote, commercial direction, shorter songs, simpler riff structures, the whole 9 yards, and we all know the results of that. They sold 30 million copies, or I don't know, however many they sold. They sold a crap load of copies of this album, and somehow it still sells thousands of copies a week. So yeah, it's easily the greatest selling metal album ever. And if you're a non-metal fan and you own one metal album, it's more than likely the Black Album, right? Let's just face it, because it's just the most common one by far. So, how good do I think it is? I think it's pretty good. It's not as good as, of course, their first 4 albums, but I'd still say it's a pretty high watermark for the band. I really enjoy it. And objectively and subjectively to me, it's still good Metallica, right? And it was kind of their, obviously we know what album's coming next, but the first 5, they had a really good streak of, being great albums. And of course, the Black Album rocketed Metallica to superstardom, where they became an utter household name, and literally everyone on Earth, including your mom, knew who they were, right? So, after the Black Album, 5 years later, we got this one to talk about. Talk about controversial. They changed their logo, and they even more dramatic. It was a bigger, more dramatic change from the Black Album to Load than it was from Justice to Load. This was an extremely dramatic change of their sound. They experimented a whole lot on this album, right? They tried a lot more bluesy type of music on it. They just really let it flow on this one. And the experiment sort of works. There are some really great songs on here. Bleeding Me, even though it's not a typical Metallica song, it's absolutely fantastic. I think Bleeding Me is an absolute masterpiece. No, it's not a typical Metallica song, but it's fantastic. I also like, even though these are very simple songs by comparison to a lot of their best stuff, I like The House That Jack Built and Until It Sleeps, and Thorn Within, Ronnie, and Outlaw Torn. So there's actually a fairly decent amount of good songs on Load, right? And even though it's not Metallica's best album, it's still worth owning, in my opinion. But by this time, Load did not have a big impact on the metal scene because it was not that metal of an album. It was like, it came out and it was like, okay, whatever. And it didn't have much impact on the overall metal scene, right? A lot of people whined and bitched about it, but as far as influencing what metal would sound like, it really didn't have an impact. I think really the last album that they did that had any impact like that was the Black Album. And then, of course, after that, they had Reload, which I don't own because it's just not very good. It was basically the leftover songs from Load, and there's less good songs on Reload than there are on Load. Less said about that, the better. And then, of course, moving on to 2003 Saint Anger. Oh my gosh. That thing is a pile of crap. There's only like 2 decent songs on it. But other than that, it's mostly an irredeemable mess. But it is entertaining, as bad as it is, right? After that, we got 2008's Death Magnetic, which I don't own due to the fact that, it's sound. The mastering on it and everything is absolutely terrible. I've already complained about that in other videos. Research it if you want to know what I'm talking about. But as far as the songwriting goes on Death Magnetic, compared to Saint Anger, it's Master of Puppets, right? But being honest, to me, Death Magnetic is, while it's somewhat enjoyable and I do like it, I don't dislike it. It's basically a somewhat paint by numbers, not quite excellent Metallica album. It's a bit mediocre, right? In comparison to a lot of their other stuff. It's like they were just trying to say, oh, people like this, let's do a song. And that's just kind of what that album reminds me of, right? It's okay, but it's certainly not great. I when I first heard it, I absolutely loved it. I thought it was an absolutely fantastic album. And then the more I listened to Death Magnetic, honestly, the more tired I got of it. It quickly wore out for me. And then, of course, we got their most recent one, 2016's Hardwired to Self-Destruct. Fantastic album. I would say very easily the best thing they've done since the Black Album. And I'd say, as far as how much I enjoy it about as much as I enjoy the Black Album. Meaning, I enjoy it quite a bit. I would definitely give it 2 thumbs up, whatever. Yeah, there's a few moments on it that aren't the best, but there are a few moments on the Black Album that aren't the best. But overall, it's an absolutely fantastic album. And for once, Metallica, after 20 years, they released something that's actually pretty good. So, how do I feel about Metallica? Are they overrated? Well, depends on what you mean by that. If you're, again, a person who thinks everything that Metallica has ever done is the greatest thing ever, well then obviously I think you're deluding yourself, just like, the same thing with Sabbath, right? Both of those bands have produced a lot of crap, right? They kind of followed similar career trajectories, right? Their initial albums were great and hugely influential. They plateaued. They hit a creative wall. They produced some absolute garbage. Then they come back and produce some really good music. And, of course, their newer music does not have the impact of their older music on the scene. It just doesn't. Basically, they can't live up to their own legacies anymore. Either band, But I'd say the same thing is probably true for really any band that achieves any sort of wide popularity in any genre, right? I don't think that's just true of these bands or just rock or metal. I think it's true for almost anything, right? You could say the same thing about Maiden, Priest, but again, I'm just going to keep naming metal bands if I do this. So anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say. It's really a very subjective thing whether you think these bands are overrated or not, just like it was subjective that I think the Beatles are overrated, right? It's all subjective. I'd really be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Anyway, as always, if you like this, thumbs up. If you hate me, thumbs down. Share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.